Hey, what's up everyone? Mekkah here, and I've got something grand for you today. What I'm going to show you are some unit stonks. What the hell are these? I made graphs for some units' performances over the course of a whole game. And I think these are a bit of a different way of looking at unit utility than, for example, tier lists, something I've done quite a bit of on this channel. Tier lists are great. They let you compare units directly. You can be like, okay, we got Roy on one side and Lance on the other side, and we'll see which one is better. And in FE6's case, that is generally Lance. He's almost always better. But sometimes it gets more complicated because sometimes a unit is better in one place of the game and worse in the other. And it's kind of apples and oranges sometimes to compare them. Of course, in order to make a tier list where you have a singular static rating for a unit, you have to do that. You have to evaluate which advantage of which unit is valued more than the other. And this can cause some arguments. Now, nothing wrong with a bit of, friendly arguing on Fire Emblem, but I thought it'd be nice to present a different kind of way of looking at unit utility. These kind of graphs give you an idea of how a unit performs throughout the entire game. So let me walk you through one of these just to give you, make it clear what exactly I did, right? So I made performance graphs for, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units in FE6. I made a couple for some other games as well that I'll walk you through in a little bit. But I'm starting with FE6. This is a game I've played very recently. And in this case, for example, I made one for Roy. So I was like, okay, how good are these units in the chapters that they're around in? For chapters they're not around in, these, I didn't give them a rating at all. You could argue whether a unit is better or worse for not existing. That's not a decision I'm going to have today. I just rated units only for the chapters that they actually exist. So I'm not going to decline any credit to negative or positive for not existing, for example. So in chapter 1 we have Roy, and I gave Roy a 7 for chapter 1. Now what does that mean? Generally, I think if a unit has the ratings are from 1 to 10. Let me just make that clear. 10 is the highest rating, 0 is the lowest rating. Or I guess 1. I don't think I had any. I do have a couple of 1s. So if a unit gets a 10 out of 10, they're the perfect unit for that chapter. They're the best unit in that chapter. There can be a tie for best units, in my opinion, but 10 is the best unit in the chapter. In every chapter, there should be a unit that has a 10, I guess. And then every rating below that is like, how far are you removed from being the best unit? If you're almost as good, you get a 9. If you're a little bit further removed, 8, 7, etc. 5, not really a passing grade, is like about perfectly average, if not a little worse, I guess. And it just goes down from there. We can discuss about the exact things, like what a 5 or a 4 or a 3 means. I don't think that's super interesting. I think I'd rather look at like the trends of unit overall. So here's how Roy's trend goes, right? He starts with a 7. I don't think he's bad in chapter 7. I think he's in chapter 1. He's okay. In chapter 7, he's actually kind of not as good. But in chapter 1, general way of hard mode, this is for hard mode, the chapter 1 works in FE6 is you weaken things with Marcus and you kill him with Roy. And Roy can do that just fine. Or you kill him with everyone else too. Like Walt can do it, but also Lance and Alan and Roy. They can all do that just fine. Boris not so much. He's better than Boris. There's no real bad units in chapter 1 besides maybe Boris. So Roy's pretty okay. Like, he's not excellent. He doesn't stand out as much as Marcus does. Like you see here, I think Lance and Alan are better. You could argue that maybe Roy should be a 6. There should be maybe a point of extra difference between Lance and Roy. But again, I'm not interested in the exact numbers right now, just the trends, right? So he's okay in chapter 1. Chapter 2, I think he's a bit worse because there are more units around that are better than Roy, most notably Deke, but also Shanna to an extent. Wade and Lot, I think, are both more useful than Roy in chapter 1 or in chapter 2, so his rating drops a little bit. I put it up a little bit higher for chapter 3 and 4 because there are Cavaliers there that Roy is better against than some other units are in situational things. Chapter 5, he's a bit worse again because chapter 5, he's good against the Executioners in forests, but he's pretty bad against like nomads and mercenaries, so maybe a bit worse there. You have no shortage of units that can tank enemy Executioners in forests, so I don't think that's like a huge point of value for him. And in chapter 6, I put him even lower because chapter 6 is full of lance users, and your other units can perform like much better than he does against like soldiers, which are very common enemy type. And so on. So he kind of stays this kind of mediocre-ish unit. Around like chapter 8, he's really bad because you got to carry him around a lot, so that's where his rating drops to like a 4. In order for him to keep up at all, you have to like drag him around, but he's not actually that good at combat, so if anything, it could be even a 3 if you wanted him to be. The rating goes up a little bit for the Western Isles. You'll notice I didn't really include any Gaian chapters. I wanted to keep it simple, and most Gaian chapters kind of resemble the chapters around them a bit. For example, the 8X enemy type variety is kind of the same as the Western Isles, so You can give him another 6 for that if you want to. So I give him like a 6 for chapter 9 because he's okay against the most economy enemy type there. And this kind of steadily drops off. You can see that in the data here, and you can see it in the graph too. He's the red one, of course, so you can see it has like a downward slope. It stops decreasing around like the route split, like chapter 16 or so. You've probably already noticed I'm really bad at making graphs and math and everything. I barely even know half the terms I'm using in English, but you know, just again, you get the point, right? You get the point. So he kind of doesn't get much worse. You can argue he's worse than a 3, but like again, that's not the whole point. I gave him a bit of a dip in chapter 21 because that's Wyvern City, and he actually gets like, I think he gets one shot by Wyvern Lord sometimes, depending on like how many robes he has. So that's like a little bit worse. He's even worse than in other chapters. And then in chapter 22, you can see that his rating actually skyrockets because, you know, what happens after chapter 21, you get to 21x, and then you don't, and then he promotes, and then he gets the Binding Blade, and suddenly he's one of your best units. Is 9 or 10 too high? I don't know. I think Roy is a great boots candidate, so I think it's fair to give him credit for having the option to fix his lower movement at that point. For example, compared to Lance, the only difference between their movements is that Roy needs 1 less pair of boots to get where Lance is. Roy has 6 and Lance has 8, so their movements are closer together in a way. Like, you can argue he needing 1 more boots is his advantage, but having more move than the other person is no longer as big as actually having 2 more move than other units. And then he hits the Binding Blade, which is super good. Like 1 round Manicheets, his 1 to range, buffs his defense. His combat performance becomes much better than it was before. Is it actually better than Lance's? I actually don't know if it's 3 points better than Lance's or not. You can argue that Lance with Multate is almost as good, but I think that Multate is shared by so many different units that it's fair to assume that Roy's Binding Blade exclusivity is better than the Multate. So just kind of put him up there, plus the fact that he has 1 to range with it and does countered by Manicheets is also very good. I think he even has a shot at one-shotting Manicheets, but it might be normal mode only. Either way, I think there's a difference between Roy and Lance in that point, and he's like significantly better. So Roy's an interesting one because he starts off like decent average-ish, and he kind of just slowly trends downwards until he like stops falling off, and then suddenly just shoots right up with the Binding Blade. And I think that creates a really funny little graph. Is this something you didn't know before? Probably not, but I think this is a cool way to visualize it. I'm not going to walk over all these units' performances, just going to like globally describe them. One interesting thing about unit performances in these, I think, is power spikes, like big drop-offs and big power spikes. For Lance, I think the biggest one, the couple biggest ones that I'd like to point out are when he promotes and when the desert hits. The desert hits chapter 14. That's when units like Lance really fall off for a little bit, only to just come back stronger. The thing with Lance that I think is intriguing to talk about is when he promotes. That's his big power spike. You get a first Night Crest at the end of chapter 8, and if you promote Lance with it, he becomes quite a bit better, and he becomes one of your best units. Like, I have him around like a 9 out of 10. I didn't give him a 10 out of 10. Maybe he should have one if he's promoted, because I can't really think of a better unit around the Western Isles. He's definitely better than Marcus and Zealot at the point, for example. Despite the advantage that they may have, I think Lance is actually better if you have been training him and promoting him. I think he would be a 10 out of 10. You could argue Rutger is better than him because Rutger's combat is more reliable. He does one-out kill more enemies. But we can argue about that. The point is he gets really good. The question is, though, you can't really incorporate for example, the opportunity cost of a promotion item into this kind of graph. We could like do this. That Night Crest could also be used by Alan, for example, and by using it on Lance, you're kind of depriving Alan of the same power boost. So does it really make him better overall? Or is this just an item that you're using on one of your units and Lance just happens to be one of the 2 that can make use of it? Maybe the credits should be split. Maybe his rating should be 8.5 because Alan could get the same power spike. I don't know, we can talk about that. But the point is, if you give it to him around chapter 9, which I've assumed for this graph, his power goes up a bit. It dips down for chapter 14. I gave him, what did I give him? I gave him a 5 for it. You might think that's too high for a model unit in the desert, but I've actually found Alan somewhat useful in the desert still because he can keep up with Roy, give him support bonuses, and still fight enemies that are close by. A lot of units don't actually have more move than that. Like, a lot of units are stuck at 2 move, and so you usually have like a caravan of 2 move units slowly trudging through the desert if you're not rescue dropping all over the place. So I still gave him a 5, and it goes back up to like a 7. I do think he is less useful in the mid to late game than he is in the early mid game. In other words, he's better in the Western Isle arc than he is post-desert. I think the enemies actually get stronger to a point where Lance and Alan have a bit of trouble hitting some benchmarks. I've actually found, for example, Percival significantly better than the Cavalier stat-wise most of the time, even according to their averages. And they have more competition for better units too, because this is also the point where Milady and Percival join, right? So there's suddenly 2 units that are better than them, which should decrease their relative value a little bit. Like, these are not absolute values, they're supposed to be a bit relative. Again, the exact math doesn't really matter that much. The point is, I found him like less than as useful. He has the same power dip here that I described earlier when this compares to Roy. Chapter 22 in general is when everyone has access to boots, so their movement advantage becomes lessened. And in general, the value of other units goes up quite a bit. So that's why I got them around the 6 right now. I don't find Alan very useful post Chapter 21 right now in my playthrough. And I think Lance goes through roughly the same thing. They give him a 7 for the final chapter, but like, you know, whatever, the final chapter. I gave Roy a 10 for that one because he can fight the final boss better than anyone else. Yeah, that's it. Okay, next up is Wade. And again, I'm not going to go through it in depth with all these, even though I really want to, as you can probably tell. But I just picked like a unit that wasn't really good to begin with, and who kind of falls off. You can see he's kind of okay in the early game with like a 7 over here, but it drops steadily. I've got him like a 3 in chapter 5 because he was so useless for me in that chapter. I actually used Wade in my last F6 run on my channel, and he's so useless in that chapter because he can't hit anyone who's on a force, anyone who has a sword, any of the nomads. They're just all really terrible enemies for him to face, and that's all it has. He's not even good against brigands either. Someone couldn't even one-out him. He just gets doubled up a lot. He's got a really big power spike actually in chapter like with a lot of soldiers, like chapter 6 and chapter 8. I gave him a 5. He's pretty good against the enemies there, but he has to be ferried around, so that kind of counts against him anyway, because chapter 8 is so movement heavy. You can see he never really recovers from this big drop off that he has. He just doesn't have any good ratings. Wade is the yellow line, so you can see he's got like an okay early game, and he just kind of drops off. And I mean, he has some spikes here and there, where I was like a bit merciful on him. Like around, I figured if you go Ilya route, he's not actually that terrible against enemy Pegasus Knights, and that's kind of where it ends. That's kind of all I can say positively about Wade. He's a funny unit, but I wouldn't really call him a good unit. He's just kind of, he never really gets above the 6 line, basically, ever after the early game. And only in easy chapters does he get like high ratings. I also put in Klein. I wanted a unit that wasn't around for the whole game, joins like the mid game, and never really dominates, but has like some good moments, right? So Klein is good in chapter 11. Let me see, the Klein line is the bluish one. It joins like around here. Oh, this is Milady, this is Klein. Okay, so Klein like starts off pretty good over here, and he kind of trends downwards. And the reason I find him trending downwards is because he's really good in the Western Isles, where really good to range is rare, and sometimes there's like flyers you can one-shot, or other utility you can do with a bow. Most notably, I gave him a 9 for chapter 12 because there's a lot of enemies fighting through walls there, and Klein is one of the best at doing that, so I gave him a 9 for that one. Maybe a bit generous, but just to point out he's better in that one than in the chapter previous or afterwards. And so after that, I generally don't found snipers super useful in my playthrough. Of course, I have Lin in my Binding Blade playthrough, so that might have cut into his potential utility a bit. But I never really found him great. I think he doesn't double reliably, so having a 6 move unit that doesn't double anything is useful for chip, but not as great as to give him like higher than like a 7. So generally his ratings is not very high. And then later in the game, he gets outclassed by a lot of units who have just better weapon access in general. There's a 7 here for chapter 21. Can you see it in the graph? I lost track of his line for a little bit. It's like around here somewhere. It's like, yeah, this is chapter 21 right here. I didn't really make a proper x-axis. If I had more time, if I spent more time making this, I probably would have one. But you can see he kind of spikes here with chapter 21 because, you know, he has flyer effectiveness, so he's good against wyverns, but I don't think he even one-shots them. Maybe with the Murglaze, but I don't remember him one-shotting wyvern lords with the silver. He definitely doesn't reliably double them. So that's like a bit of a 7. It's like, okay, and everything else is kind of average-ish. As a joke, I included Sophia, who is never good, and it's really hard to figure out exactly how to rate Sophia. This is a good highlight of another potential problem, which is favoritism. I kind of touched upon it with the Nightcrest. You can see Sophia starts around here at the bottom with like a 1. I gave her 1 out of 10. You could argue it should be a 0, but again, who cares about the exact numbers, right? So Sophia starts her out with like a 1, and then I slowly made her increase a bit until she has a 4 in endgame. This is completely arbitrary because Sophia's performance, exactly how good she is in later chapters, depends entirely on how much favoritism you give her. If you don't really favor Sophia all that much, she's going to be a 1. You have to hard focus on her to make her better. And how good that makes her, I mean, that's entirely up to you. I assumed you'd raise her enough to where she's a 4. I don't even know how much exact favoritism it takes to make her a 4 out of 10. It could be that you give her so much favoritism, like all your stat boosters, you just buy like Angelic Robes until she has 60 HP. Yeah, you feed every enemy ever to her, you arena grind her, everything, That might make her like a 10 out of 10. Maybe, I don't know. Probably not, because she'd still miss movements. But maybe after chapter 21, you also give her enough boots to get the 50 move. I don't know. But like, you can see it trends upwards, because I do think even a unit like Sophia probably gets a little bit better over time. But the real cost is the opportunity cost of getting her there. Dealing with a bad unit isn't all that difficult or impossible. It's more just how much effort are you willing to put in before calling it a day, and how much more do you need than other units. And this is something that these graphs are not very good at. The advantage of tier lists is that they take everything into account, whereas this is basically, if you deploy a unit in this chapter, how good are they, reasonably speaking? And the details, I find, are a little bit harder to discuss. But that's how Sophia trends. Like, slowly goes upwards, and how fast upwards, that's up to you. Finally, I have Milady. I put her at like a 7 for chapter 13 because she's still unpromoted there and probably not that good. And then it kind of depends just how hard you invest into Milady, how fast she shoots up to a 10, but I think it's inarguable that she becomes a 10 out of 10 eventually. I think Milady is your best unit for the second half of the game, no contest. I think she's better than Percival. Percival might also be a 10 in some other instances, especially if you fight more mages. But Milady is just so good, I don't think you can have a different rating for her than 10. You can see my graph doesn't really handle 10s very well, they just kind of stick to the top. If I made a different scale, maybe it's more pleasing to the eye. But yeah, Milady peaks for most of the game. I had a slight drop off here. You could argue there should be a drop off at the boots point because enemies, your audience, catch up in movement to her. But she still has flight, which I think is still a big advantage. I only dropped her off to a 9 in 24, which is the Mannequin chapter, because in that one there is no advantage to flight. I don't remember there being any pillars that matter. Maybe thrones, but you never really have to move over a throne as far as I recall. So her flyerness doesn't really matter at that point. She still has Canto, which is good, but she also needs the Maltate, which is the most common enemy type lances. So a lot of units can use the Maltate. So if you didn't have Maltate, you bring someone else. A lot of these other units, for example, especially Roy with the Binding Blade. If you don't use Roy, you don't have the Binding Blade. Whereas if you don't use Milady, you still have the Maltate. So I made her drop a point for that. And then against Idun, she's not especially notable. So I dropped her off a little further, but she's still better than everyone except Roy for that chapter. So that kind of rating goes with a grain of salt. But I think these 10s kind of speak for themselves. So that's the way these units trend in FE7, FE6. I have a couple more graphs to show you guys that I think are interesting to look at. But it's just to give you an idea, like, okay, you got these units and they have like different almost tier positions for every single chapter. And I think it's really interesting to see how that intertwines. You can probably make prettier graphs than this. This is just what I did real quick with Google Sheets. I made another one for FE7 that I'm going to show you real quick. Alright, and here I'm going to introduce something that I think is very interesting, which is Marcus, a Jagan unit, because I didn't really put FE6 Marcus in there in the last one. I probably could have, but you know what, we got to have something exclusive to the FE7 one, right? So I got Hector, Eliwip, Marcus, Florina, Heath, Harkon, and Athos. I think Athos is the funniest by far because he's just a little dot at the end where he's like a 10 out of 10 for the final chapter, and that's it. I just thought it was funny to include him there. Units with different availability always produce like interesting results. You can see this kind of data line is like, how do you even compare this? This really reflects the problem you have in tier lists a lot, where you have like a Goto kind of unit that joins really late, but they're really good. How do they compare to a mediocre unit? Tier lists can't really handle that kind of comparison. It's like you have to add up everything a unit does and then compare it to someone who is not around except for a single chapter. This kind of graph shows it much better. If you're looking for like how good a unit is within a single chapter, this is much more helpful than a tier list in my opinion. Or a character guide in honestly the same way. I keep kind of pretending that tier lists are like recommendation guides, but they're really more unit evaluations. They have overlaps, but they're not exactly the same. Anyway, that's Athos. That's a short story. So Hector, I think, is an interesting one. He has the most consistent, but the most like weirdest downfall, I guess, of all units. Where he starts out as a 10 out of 10 in chapter 11 because you have two units, Matthew and Hector. That's it. That's all you got. So he starts out perfect, and then for the rest couple chapters, he is really one of your best units. He's tanky, who can really compete with Hector in the early game, like Marcus, Oswin, and List, basically. Those are the units that are better than Hector. So I still thought it's fine to give him a 9 out of 10. But as the game progresses and units promote and everything, he gets worse and worse relatively. But it's like slow. Like Hector is never bad. Like the worst is like around chapter 25, 6, 7, 8. That's like around here somewhere. That's when Hector becomes like mediocre, kind of in the way-ish. So he can still like chip damage or like tank enemies here and there. but it's not really what you want to use. Generally, you have units that are faster, maybe not as tanky as Hector is. He's still kind of bulky, but generally more mobile, more flexible. Hector is like kind of annoying to use in that point in the game. And for a lot of people, he's also capped at level 20, which also adds to the annoyance. But that's more of a unit feel thing. Like if he's good at level 20, you should still use him at level 20. But this is when he stops growing, at least. Like, he stops having more potential. This is especially a big deal in Hector normal mode. In Hector hard mode, sometimes he doesn't even level cap unless you use him like a lot, because hard mode XP gain is kind of gamer. So you have him like around like a 5 out of 10. I got him a big dip here in Cog Destiny chapter 29, because that chapter is all magic units in FE7, so he becomes a like actual liability. And it's tough to keep him alive. You can still do a couple things here and there, but everyone else is carrying the main combat there. You don't want to rely on Hector during Cog of Destiny, even though, you know, technically you think Wolf is good against Valkyries, but, you know, Hector is very vulnerable in Cog of Destiny. If you use him too much, you're actually walking into a game over, most likely. So don't use Hector too much. But then he promotes, and for chapter 30, the Berserker, I gave him an 8. It's a bit weird with Hector, because his promotion doesn't give him a lot that he wants. He doesn't gain any movement, and he gets like a decent amount of speed, but he doesn't get a lot of bulk out of it. He's still one of 2 units in the Berserker and Hector hard mode, so I still gave him an 8. And whoever you bring along with him is probably going to be needed to do everything, because Hector, he can do everything. The chapter's made for him to do everything, but it's going to be slow because he still has 5 moves. So for like an efficient playthrough, which this is kind of based on, you do want something better than just Hector. So I didn't want to give him a 10 out of 10 for that, basically. And after that, I gave him like a 7.76, not just because of Thracia, but also like in Sands of Time and Victory Death in the final chapter. Hector's nice, I guess. If you trained him, he's kind of under-leveled at that point, so he needs some XP to get going, but his XP is kind of fast. But he still has the problem where he doesn't have a lot of mobility to the other units. Like, he retains a lot of the problems he had before promoting, but to a lesser degree. And he's also harder to carry around because he just gained con, so units like Fiora can't even pick him up anymore. So that's kind of annoying. So that's the story of Hector. Like, it starts really good, it goes down over the course of the game, and shoots up back with his promotion, but just because his personal chapter and everything else is still kind of okay. He peaks in the early game. He peaked when he joined. Eliwood is kind of the opposite. I had him started like a 3 out of 10, and I kind of increased him slowly to show like, okay, his growths do outpace the enemies, but he's never really good for basically the entire game. I had like a couple 6s out here for chapters where he's like force deployed, and kind of like, if you train Eliwood, he's better in chapter 20 in Dragon's Gate than if he's not, right? But it still kind of isn't all that spectacular. I got him like a 3 in Crazed Beast. I don't remember exactly why. The Desert Chapter, I got him a 3 as well, because his mobility gets inhibited. Actually, Hector shouldn't have a high rating for Desert Chapter either. It should be like a 4. There you go, have that dip. Desert Chapter is bad for everyone. Anyway, Eliwood has like a bad time. And what happens in chapter 26? That's when he gets the first promotion item. That's when you get the first Heaven Seal. That's when you can promote Eliwood finally. He gets like a 7. I don't think he's one of the best units you have. I don't think he's as good as if you had like a trained Lowen, Kent, Sane, Marcus. Yeah, trained Marcus, and we'll get to that in a minute. I don't think he's as good. He has 1 less move. His stats are probably on par with them, but the move, it is a thing. But he has some useful utility, so again, like a 7 out of 8 for the rest of the game, basically. He's pretty alright. You got chapters like Sense of Time and Final Chapter where he's forced, so again, you're better off with using Eliwood than not using Eliwood in those chapters. I say better off because in that chapter particularly, you're better off with trained Eliwood. Doesn't mean I recommend training Eliwood overall. As you can see, most of what you get is mediocrity. Like, this assumes you actually use a character, like not just based off Eliwood sitting around doing nothing. Like, this is actually trying to use Eliwood like a growth unit, like training him up. I think this is what you get. So is it worth coping with a unit that has these ratings just to have a power spike after chapter 26? That's kind of what this graph tries to represent. Is that worth it? Eliwood is of course the red line over here. Never really indicated any properly, but this is kind of how it goes. Then we have Marcus in good old Jagan fashion, starting off with a bunch of 10s. Marcus is the gray line that's like over here. Starts out all the way at the top and then just zooms down for desert map. That's still a 6. I think he's still decent there. You don't actually start that far into desert, so you can have him go onto the grass and do some Marcus things. I remember Donna didn't deploy Marcus for the desert, but I think generally Marcus is fine to use there. Not worth giving like a bad grade for. After that, I still think he's like a good. You might think I'm overrating him for like giving him 10s and 9s and 8s, but if you use Marcus throughout the game and have him get boss kills, you can actually reasonably hit some thresholds that make him still useful. And there's not many units in FE7 that really beat Marcus outright in every regard. There's always something for him to do because Marcus does have some good stats, notably his skill and res are very standout, so he's always going to be able to enemy face something. The weapon triangle, even if he doesn't double everything, which oftentimes he still will, Even if he doesn't double anything, he's still useful for something generally. So even though I think there's units that are better in the late game, like Florian and Heath, who we'll get into in a moment, or better with combat, like, I don't know, Harken or Pent, I still think Marcus is very powerful for most of the game. So I try to make the ratings reflect that. So that's why we got like a bunch of 9s and 8s here. I got a 6 for the Berserker because I wouldn't bring Marcus to that one. You probably have better options there. And then not very good in the final chapter, for example. This is the one, there was one chapter where Marcus is actually kind of bad in the final chapter, but you would still probably use him for rescue drops if you didn't really deploy. If you didn't really train like 10 other units, you probably still deploy Marcus. So that's how he goes. Florina starts off like kind of bad. I still rate her, like, I gave her some points for her fly utility early on, because I think that's still really good for her. So that's why she starts with a 6, but her stats are really awful. It's just there's some utility that she can do early on that's really good. That kind of helps her, but like she's like a 5 in chapter 17. That's like still somewhat generous. The mounted movements, you can still help without risking you, but she's very limited by the archers. So that's why she got a 5 in chapter 17. It doesn't really go up anywhere. And again, we're like faced with the question, do we give her points for her promotion? And if so, when do we give that? I kind of assumed like a chapter, like a promotion around here somewhere where she gets good. I knew I wanted to give her a good rating for the desert because, you know, she flies. If there's no, if she's not getting like an 8 or higher for the desert, then why are we even here, right? So she has an 8 for the desert, and I kind of assumed like if she's not promoted at the desert, at least she should be promoted after the desert. And after that, when Florina has snowballed, she's actually kind of good in Hector hard mode. You still have to be a bit careful with her, but her fly utility is now really good, and her combat utility is at the very least passable. So she should get like 8s and 9s, and I gave her a 10 for Victory Death for being able to carry Hector around. I've playing a lot of FE7 lately, but mostly draft races, which are done on Hector normal mode. It's possible that she's a fair bit worse than this on Hector hard mode, but I think the trend generally works. Heath, kind of like Florina, has very similar ratings, but he joins a bit later. But he doesn't have to go through this stage of mediocrity. He just kind of starts off passable in his joining chapter, and he never really is bad. He is always bulky and just about fast enough to double, so I never really gave him a bad rating. His res is obviously garbage, so for example, Cog of Destiny is where Florina kind of beats Heath, but other than that, they're pretty similar. You can see you kind of, I'm tempted to just go here for the exact ratings instead of looking at my graphs. It's something I've noticed. Florina's like the pink line over here, and Heath is the yellow line, and they're kind of intertwined in the graph as well. That's why I'm referring to my data instead of going to the graph. But the graph kind of visualize it in a funny way. I kind of wish I didn't go up and down in my ratings so much. That's kind of makes it look, it's a bit more annoying to look at. I also think I should have done more smooth lines. Then we got Harken. It's pretty self-explanatory, just a really good unit, but he joins very late, so he has like a bunch of high ratings. A bit lower in the Berserker because that deployment slot is in high demand, and Harken can't really make Hector go any faster. But everywhere else is like 8s and 9s. So you could argue he's a 10 out of combat, but he still is not mounted, so no perfect rating, just really good. He's the green line over here, so he's doing all right for himself. But I guess the question that's raised here is, hey, how good is this small part of the graph compared to something like this that Hector's line is, or Eliwood's? Like, is Eliwood's mediocrity over the whole game more useful than Harken's short burst of being really good with no investment? I think that's a fair question to ask, and this is a question that tier lists also ask themselves, but the graph visualizes it a bit more. Something else that the graphs, I think, don't represent very accurately that they probably should, or that you kind of want them to for like an accurate grasp of the rating, is right now the graph kind of gives an equal weight to every chapter that there is in the game. You can see that like chapter 11 is given the same weight as chapter 32, even though in chapter 11 you only have 2 units and not really a lot of choices to make. So is Hector being good in his joining chapter equally valuable as, you know, another unit being better in Cog of Destiny, a chapter that has like 50 enemies you gotta kill, and they're all more dangerous than the enemies in chapter 11, and the chapter is much more hard, and there's like actual units you can deploy and not deploy, whereas in chapter 11 you don't really have a choice. Does that matter? Well, I think it does, and I think this doesn't really do a great job of taking that into account. What you could do instead, if you were like really sadistic, is instead of making a graph based per chapter, you could base it by enemies. So you'd have a gigantic graph based on which enemies you could fight with a unit, from like the chapter 11 soldiers to the chapter 30 like Nurgle basically, and have a unit with the rating against how useful are they against every enemy. Obviously this still doesn't represent everything, it doesn't represent movements, but at least it would solve the problem of not weighing every enemy or every chapter equally. Now I said every enemy by accident, but you can guess the next question. Should every enemy have equal weight? Should bosses have more weight than others? I think all these things are interesting. I think I've seen a simulation before where every unit and their averages are actually weighed in their performance against every enemy in the game. I think I've seen that for FV8 at one point on someone's channel. I wish I could remember which one it was. I just remember that it existed. But yeah, that's FV7. I got one more to show you, a very chaotic one. Give me 1 second to pull it up here. Of course, I had to add I had to do something chaotic to my charts as well, so I made one for FE10, only for a couple of Dawn Brigade units, because otherwise this gets even more chaotic. You can see this is already a bit of a mess. Not as bad as it could be, but I like the whole big gap that you got here in the middle for part 3. So this is the Dawn Brigade. What I did is I put like every chapter here that FE10 has, and I gave him a number, kind of like the normal FE's numbering way. So after part 1, I just went on with numbering like 11, 12, etc. Otherwise the graph wouldn't even work properly. So this is my actual x-axis. Then you just got the Dawn Brigade units here with their usual ratings. I don't think I need to explain very in depth how these go. Mekkah starts off as one of the very few units you have, so her ratings in the beginning are very high. She's the blue line, but she drops off with every chapter that she's in, and only recovers when she promotes in 1E. I forgot what she has an 8 in 1E, probably because she sacrifices there. I don't even know what the idea is. She probably shouldn't be that high for 1E. She's more like a bad unit there. Let's give her a 2 for being able to sacrifice. There you go. Much better. But yeah, that's Mekkah for you. And in part 3, she has healing utility, so she's a lot bit better there. You can see that in like the end, I got like 312, 313, and then part 4 and map performance in a row. There actually should be like an empty spot here for 3 endgame, but you get the point, right? Part 4, like the chapters before endgame, and then the tower. What's this part right here? What did it say again? Oh, right, it's map 1 and part 1. Yeah, map 1 and map 2. This is how good they are in the pre-endgame maps. Let me just fix this up right here so it actually looks a little bit neater. Yeah, so map 1 and map 2 before endgame, and then endgame is like a separate map of themselves. And it bother giving a separate rating for every endgame map, because usually units are the same or roughly the same within endgame. So I just gave her a 7 for that one for staff utility and call it a day. So she's decent at the end, but she does go through like a pretty bad spell mid-late part 1. Soth is, kind of follows the same curve, but at a way different level. He's the red line, so he starts off like the best unit you have, and he drops off as part 1 goes along. You get more and more strong units, but he stays competitive. And then in part 3, no longer as good, still sort of viable, and he drops off like a rock. I've been told that I slightly overrate how badly Soth drops off, but I really don't find him very good in part 3, or part 4 for that matter. Mostly part 4 I think is really bad. Only promotes before the desert map, if I recall, and even there he's not that great. Does he promote before or after desert? Doesn't matter, he's not that good anyway. And in endgame, he's forced there, so this is not a complete liability, but I generally don't deploy Soth if I have a choice. There's even unit slot competition within endgame, because you have like 2 units you can't bring to, I think, 4 and 5, and you should ditch Soth for those, because he's just the worst unit available no matter who you bring. If you're bringing someone endgame, they're probably trained to be better than Soth, so that's why he's like a 4. But you can still shove Raphael if he's deployed, so that's why he's got like some kind of rating there. But he's not very good there. And then Nolan is more like a representative of more like a usual growth unit, but again, he follows roughly the same curve of the Dawn Brigade, where he just starts off as like the best unit you have, like a 10 out of 10. Like, gotta give credit where it's due. That's what this kind of graphs is good for. Starts off as like a 10 out of 10 in his joining chapter, and it is every chapter a strong like Jake and Ass unit joins until in like 1-8, for example, you have like 5, 6, 7 units that are better than him. And he can't do a whole lot that helps your army, so he's more of a self-improver. Not terrible, but he's kind of just there. And in part 3, he does pick up. I think a 3-6 is actually one of your better units. You could argue he should be a 10 here, because I can't really think of many units that are better than Nolan in 3-6. Maybe Zyark, if you give him the proper support. Although Nolan could be just as good in 3-6, so maybe not. Black Knight is probably better than him, although he's not around for a couple turns, so maybe he should be higher for 3-6. Maybe we should give him a 9, but the point is it's one of his best chapters. And then 3-12 and 3-13, I don't think he's as good, but still pretty good. And then Endgame is kind of like, not as generic, like not standout in any way, but not bad either, especially if you've trained him, so he's pretty alright there. And then like a bit of representative of Radiant Dawn and what it's like in General's Tyronio. He's not around for like in half the game, like 3/4 of the game, and then he exists in 1-6, which is actually 2 maps, but I represented that as 1. And he's like this little dot over here. Let me see if I can find him. It's like what chapter number is it? Chapter 6 on this. So yeah, right here, this green dot over here, that's Ronio. That's his part 1 performance in a nutshell, just a 10 out of 10. Impossible to kill unless you put him against the hammer guy. Who would ever do that, right? And then you can see this little dot is Soth in I think this is like 3-6. Soth and Nolan, and Micaiah's over here. I don't know why her rating goes like this. Oh, that's because 1-9, because the Black Knight who's like right in between here. This is why Micaiah's line goes through here, and then Nolan and Soth doesn't. That's part of what makes this like whole graph so chaotic. This is 3-6. Tony doesn't exist for that one. Then he comes back roaring here in 3-12 and 3-13 with like an 8 out of 10. Maybe a little bit too high, but the point is he's pretty viable there. But in part 4 and the tower, he's not a great unit. He's viable, he's usable with 6 and a 5, but he's not great. So that's kind of how Radiant Dawn goes. I didn't even bother with the Grim Mercenaries in this one because I didn't want this to be too chaotic, but this is where you probably want to make a couple of different graphs, one for like the Dawn Brigade and one for the Grim Mercenaries, for example, and maybe one for the Crimean Royal Knights to kind of keep them apart. That's what I did for my my character guide, and that could be one cool way to represent it. I'm just making this to show a bit of a work in progress and a fun way to represent units that I think are interesting. If you like this video, then let me know what else you think could be done with this. I think this has a ton of potential for just fun discussion and just a little bit of stuff for like data nerds. I'm not actually that big of a spreadsheet person, but I did enjoy making this, so I hope you guys like it as well. Invest in Ike Stonks now, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.